Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first event of the Arts 101 series. My name is Emily Ogier-Murray, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Fine Arts. I have the pleasure of introducing our instructor, Kaleigh Rusgrove. Kaleigh began making photographs at age 13 with her family's point-and-shoot camera and quickly determined it was a habit she should never give up. She received her BFA in Visual Communication from Endicott College in 2014, an MFA in Studio Art from UConn in 2018, and was the recipient of a 2019 Fulbright grant, which brought her to Sydney, Australia to work with the Royal Botanic Garden. And with that, thank you all for coming. Have fun.
Hi, everybody, and thank you, Emily, for that introduction, and thank you to you and Lauren for asking me to be a part of this series. I'm really excited to talk to everybody today about photography. Like Em mentioned, I went to UConn for my master's where I studied photography further, and I know that we are living in this increasingly digital visual world. And we've gotten actually a lot of emails about people who have been saying, I take pictures for work now. I need some help shooting with my phone. And so I think it's something that everybody can get a little bit out of to hopefully better their experience online and with photography. So that being said, when I was starting to prepare for today, something that kept coming up to me in thinking about shooting on a phone, I shoot with my iPhone pretty regularly, is that the ideas that I was coming up with, they're not overly specific to shooting with a phone. When I think about what makes a really great photo, it comes back to those basics of photography. And so really what I'm going to be talking about today is how to shoot with your phone, but also how to think like a photographer. And I almost think that thinking like a photographer is more important than knowing that really specific techie part of shooting on a phone. So to start off, I just want to say that something that might help you more than anything else is to stop thinking about your phone as just a phone or a camera phone, and start thinking about it as a camera. And that might sound a little cheesy, but I think it's true. And it's something that I had a lot of trouble with prior to grad school. I was also shooting with like a very old iPhone, so that didn't help. But finally, my committee head was like, you're shooting with your phone all the time. It's a camera. You need to just be thinking about it as a camera. And so that's what I would encourage all of you to do as well, is to think of your phone not just as a phone, but as a camera. What I always tell my students is that a camera is just a tool. So you're using an analog film camera, a big beefy DSLR, or an iPhone the same way. Photography is literally translated to light writing, writing with light. And so what any camera is doing, even a little pinhole or toy camera, is it's taking in information through light and it's saving it onto some kind of substrate. So for a film camera, that's going to be a little piece of plastic. For a big DSLR, that's going to be a pretty large sensor. On your iPhone, it's going to be a slightly smaller sensor. At the end of the day, all we're doing is we're taking that scene and we're saving it. One of my favorite pieces of information is that we've taken more photos collectively as humanity in the last 2 minutes than were taken in the entirety of the 19th century. And so we're living in this increasingly visual world, especially with the advent of something like Instagram. That's how we're communicating, is through these little pictures, these little snapshots every day. And so how do you make your photos stand out? So it goes two ways. We're taking so many pictures. There's so many pictures you have to compete with to get your information out there. And then also we're taking a lot of pictures, but some of them are not that good. And so a piece of advice that I always give is that the more pictures you take, the better you'll be at it. So that might be one of my first big pieces of advice as well, is to just keep trying, and just keep thinking about what you're doing a little more intently than you were prior. So hopefully after today, you'll just be taking even more pictures with your phone and not bypassing opportunities that you see that come up. So like I said, I want everyone to walk away to think a little more like a photographer. And because your phone is just a camera, and that's what we're going to be thinking about it as today, two things that always come down to to make a good photo is composition and light. And I'm going to talk about composition first and then light. Light might be like number one above everything else. And I am going to go through like how I actually use my phone and some of my editing after I go through this little bit of more artistic speak, if you will. So I'm going to talk about setting a scene as opposed to necessarily just straight composition. I know we have people here from all different schools. Some of you might be from the School of Fine Arts and you're like, oh, I already know about composition. I got the rule of thirds down. But I think what I think about when people are not taking the best possible pictures on their phone, it's because they're not thinking about the scene. And again, we're just like, okay, this is my phone. I'm going to take a picture really quickly. It is what it is. They're not treating this as a camera. And so that means they're doing it really quickly and kind of innately like what they think they should be doing. I always think of my mom. She wants to take a picture of like the grandkids or something. And she's just like, okay. And I can see her like zooming in and just like at the most awkward angle. When I was first asked to do this workshop, I started thinking about these girls I worked with last year. I was doing some social media work and they were like, Kaleigh, can you take a picture of my latte? I was like, why do you need me to take a picture of your coffee? Well, because you went to school for this, you're really good at it. And I'd say, well, show me what you took. And it was a truly horrible picture. And I started to realize the things that kept coming up time and time again is that the scene that they were setting made no sense or it just wasn't clean. So there would just be like all this stuff in the background. It would be overexposed. They just weren't thinking about what it was going to look like, but they didn't understand that that's what made my picture a little bit better than their picture. It was just I took those 2 seconds to compose the scene. And that also goes with one of the most important lessons I've learned in photography, which is thinking about, are you focused more on the thing itself or are you focused on the photo that you're taking? And so what I mean by that is, are you like hyper focused on taking a picture of your morning coffee or are you thinking about how you're taking that picture, which might kind of sound like the same thing to a lot of you. But what you need to start doing is thinking about this hierarchy. So sometimes we're so desperate, like, I just need to make this picture of something for work, or I really want to make this picture of something that I see out in the world. And we're not really focused on, okay, is this a good picture? Am I making this the strongest picture I can? And we're just like, okay, got to get that thing. And we're not thinking about composition. We're not thinking about what's behind it. We're not thinking about if it's too bright. I've made more worthwhile photos of garbage than I have of some like really wonderful things that I found in the world, simply because I've been focused on using my technical skills as a photographer to say, okay, like the light is really lovely right now. It's shining through this piece of plastic. It looks like this wonderful sculptural moment, as opposed to whatever it is, like a beautiful fall landscape. But if it's just really crappy lighting, you're not going to get a good picture out of that. So I'm not suggesting that you all start photographing trash, but I would say that before you start shooting, you want to kind of create this mental flow chart. And part of that is, how do you want your subject to come across? And if you have the right kind of scenario to make that happen. So some people might say, well, I don't really know what that means. Like, I don't know what good lighting is. I don't know how to compose something. What I would say is, always think about how you see other people taking pictures. So kind of the trope is that everyone is just like this in the world. You see pictures of other people taking pictures like this. And so every photo you take is going to be from your eye line, your point of view. You want to start to switch that up. That would be number one. So you want to get down low, you want to get up high, you want to adjust the angle that you're photographing at. So it's not just straight on exactly as you are. You can adjust your body, move to a different angle. You can move across the room. You can get closer or further away. These are all things that are just like natural to do, but we often forget. We get so caught up in the moment of taking the photograph that we don't take those few minutes to take a few steps forward, a few steps back, think about what's going on. You know, is there something really distracting at the edge of your frame? Are you cutting off the top of somebody's head? Are you cutting off their feet really awkwardly? Like, is their whole body in the frame, but not their feet? Just really take a minute to look at what you're photographing and think about how you want that to come across. I'm going to talk next about light, but that's also something you can physically move yourself to a different location with better light. You could move yourself to a location with a better background. You can move your subject matter most times, but if you can't move your subject, move yourself. Um, in terms of basic composition, I kind of threw out rule of thirds there before, and I'm sure many of you have heard of that. It's the idea of splitting up your frame into quadrants, so it basically becomes 9 quadrants. So thirds going this way, and then thirds going this way. And if you're shooting with a camera phone, like an iPhone, it actually already has that grid set out for you. If it's not showing up, you can adjust that in your camera settings so that you can see it. And what you want to do is kind of put your subject matter on those third lines. So when I was in undergrad, we were always taught if you're shooting a portrait, you want like their head or even like their eye to end up on one of those cross sections. If you're shooting a landscape, it's great to have either the horizon line at the bottom or the top third. This can start to sometimes feel a little stale or forced if it's what you're always doing all the time. Like, say you love photographing landscapes and every single picture on your Instagram is just the same rule of thirds landscapes. So you can switch things up. I always break the rules. I always center weight things, which is actually a huge no-no in the photography world, but I really love to do that. Especially in a place like Instagram, I'm comfortable breaking some of the rules. And I think a lot of the photos that you find online are a little more graphic or don't necessarily always follow the same trend that you would see traditionally in photography. So I always plop things right in the center and roll with it. And some people might be like, that's terrible. I really hate it. But as many rules and tips that I'm giving you today, I would encourage you to just use it as like a jumping off point. And so if you find a way of shooting that you really like, then go for it. But the basics are always what you're going to come back to make kind of a clean, well organized photo. Another thing you want to think about is leading lines. So that's going to be lines that are going through your image that kind of keep the focus in your image and then also leading out of the frame. So if you're working on a landscape, you want something that's going to kind of go out into infinity off the edge of the frame. It just creates interest, keeps people invested in the image that you've created. And then also pay attention to the corners of your frame. So even if you are going to say center weight something, a way that you can jazz it up and make it a little more of an exciting composition is by having something kind of peeking in from the corner, peeking off, going off the frame. But equally, you want to pay attention. Like I said, I think the death of a good photo is if there's like this crazy, busy something or other in the corner of the background that you don't notice. So if there's like a little mess in the corner and you're just so hyper focused on like, I gotta get this picture of my dinner, you might not notice it until afterwards. And you're like, oh, sure, you can crop that out, but it might change things overall. It might change your aspect ratio in a way that doesn't really make sense. So the most that you can do when you're shooting, the better. So the second thing I said, so that was just like super basic composition, is light. And light is the most important thing when it comes to photography. And this is where there is kind of a difference in between an iPhone or using an actual camera. And that's that there's not quite as much adjustment you can do with an iPhone as you could with, say, a DSLR. So some of you who shoot pretty regularly on your phone probably have noticed that you can take a picture, but there's only so much that you can change. And so when I'm shooting, I always shoot just in like the regular iPhone camera. I don't use a special app. I have used some of them. I've even had one of those attachable lenses before that starts to like mimic a DSLR. I really like it to be like quick and easy. And I just shoot in the basic camera mode. And then I try to do some adjusting after. There is still some adjustments to be made in here. And I didn't say this at the beginning, I plan to. Some of these things might be so second nature to you already because you're shooting a lot on your phone. And for some of you guys, you might be like, I had no idea I should even touch the screen when I take a picture. So I'm sorry if some of it seems like a little obvious, but I think then I think of my mother and she's like, I don't know how to take a picture on my iPhone at all. It's blurry. What do I do? You always want to tap on what your subject matter is, where you want to pull focus. And you can also adjust the intensity and the brightness. And so I'm going to show you like a little bit like how I do that in a second. But you can adjust the light a little bit. You can adjust the aspect ratio. You can adjust certain things. But at the end of the day, the iPhone is going to make a lot of decisions for you. It's the same thing as shooting in automatic mode on a digital camera. Or if any of you are big film buffs, it's like choosing your ISO on a film. You can't change it. You have 400 ISO, you can't change it once it's loaded. So you also have to know the limitations of the tool you're using. And so the iPhone is going to make some adjustments. You can get a proprietary app if you want to try to play with ISO and shutter speed. I think it's still trying to like stretch something that's not really meant to do that. So I'd rather use the tool to the best of its ability. And so when we're thinking about that, I'm like, okay, I can't really compensate in the iPhone. So what can I do? And that's add light. And so my number one place to take a picture on my iPhone anytime is next to a window. Whatever, like the brightest window I can find in my room, I actually have a sliding glass door, and I will put down like a piece of foam core and or a piece of fabric or something next to the window if I'm taking a picture of food. So I love to cook, so that's why I keep coming back to this like food example, is that's probably my baby and like what I ate for dinner are like the number one things I take pictures of. And so I'll put it down next to the window so that I'm getting that huge burst of light in through the window. If you don't have a window, or say it's already pretty dark so you're not getting much light, pull a lamp over. But you're going to get a different effect. So that's what you can't, again, you can't make something do something that it doesn't want to do. So you're not going to get some like studio level, perfectly crisp and clear image if it's 8 o'clock at this time of year when we have like, it's basically midnight. It might as well be, it's so dark. And you just have a lamp. It's going to be a little blurrier, a little grittier because you're pushing that iPhone as far as it can go. So then you just kind of need to know, like, you're not going to take some promo shot for work if you've made like a really great drink or a product that you're trying to promote. You're not going to take that at 8 p.m. with just like a regular lamplight. But I'll show you an example of like I took a picture of my husband last night, and I'm fine with losing that little bit of detail. But if I want something that's like tack sharp as much as I can get out of the iPhone, I'm going to do it in the morning, maybe later in the afternoon. Next to a window, you can even do high noon because you're just going to be getting all that light and it's going to filter through the glass. If you're taking images outside, high noon is the worst time of day to do it. So you'll start to see as you photograph more what works and what doesn't. Outside at high noon for a portrait, it doesn't work because you're going to get these crazy shadows. But how can we work with that? We're going to find like a nice pocket of shade under a tree, under like the overhang of a house, something like that, so you're not getting that blaring sun on you. If it is nighttime and you're inside, you don't have a good lamp to use, you can even get, I pulled this out, I used to use these in grad school all the time, they're little like clamp light lamps from Home Depot. You can put a daylight balanced bulb in it. These do get very hot, so I wouldn't leave them on for too long or too close to you. I think the LED bulbs might be a little better than, I think this is actually like a regular tungsten light bulb I have in here. Very warm. Or one of the wonderful things about the advent of everybody zooming and doing things on their webcam is that you can get a little bank of LED light. So you can get them pretty cheap. I actually have one on right now and it's quite large. I would turn my screen so you can see it, but my office is really horrifyingly messy right now. It's just like a round bank. I got it for like $100 from B&H. They make ones you can get on Amazon for like $25. And so those are really good. Some of you might already have them and just not be thinking about utilizing it for your iPhone photography. You're just using it in your office for when you're Zooming during meetings. Bring that out, bring it into your living room to take the portrait that you want to take, to just like burst in a little bit of light. But my first choice is always to go outside or to get close to a window. I really like daylight. I think it's very soft looking, very natural looking. But you just have to be aware of shooting in that early morning hour or end of day hour, especially the hour after sunrise and before sunset is when you're going to get like a beautiful golden light, or just less harsh shadows when you get further to those extremes of the day. The other thing that I'll say is don't be tempted to use your iPhone flash. So that's something, again, like thinking of people in my life who do this. My little sister will always use the iPhone flash, and it's just too aggressive and you can't control it. I think the only time I would ever use the iPhone flash is maybe to fill in shadows if I was outside, say at high noon. But because it's coming directly from your eyesight and where you're shooting, it just looks a little false and a little fake. Um, Before I ever use the iPhone flash to take a picture, say inside at night when I don't have light, I would always try to either move my subject closer to a light source or move a light source closer to my subject. And so I think that will always give you a more natural, more, I think natural is like the best word, less forceful looking photo. Although, unless you're going for like a really punchy, intense nighttime flash, then maybe yeah, you could go for it. They also make little Bluetooth speaker, not Bluetooth speaker, Bluetooth accessible flashes. So they'll connect to your phone through Bluetooth, and you can actually shoot them off if you're very, very serious about shooting and wanting good light at night. So you can find those on Amazon or B&H. So I am going to show a couple slides before I get into like more basic shooting stuff with you guys, just so that you can see what exactly what I'm talking about. Oh no, there we go. So when I was talking about literal trash, this is one of my examples. I did a little scroll through my phone to find some of the images like that I had in mind of when I was shooting on my phone. When I was in grad school, I was walking a lot, and I was actually using some of these images that I took on my phone while walking as part of my thesis, because you're going to naturally see more when you're out and about. And if you always wait to come back with an actual camera, you're going to miss the moment. The light's going to have changed. Your subject might be gone. And so I think that's the beauty of always being ready and prepared to shoot with a camera that's in your pocket. And so there's this sense of space and time. The light is a little harsh, but in the moment I was like, I'm fine with that. There's that hint of the ground extending beyond the frame at the bottom where you can start to see the asphalt. Very artsy-fartsy picture, but I think the rules still apply. These also, so everything I'm showing was taken on my phone over the last couple of years. So paying really close attention to light. So light streaming through the leaves or onto this plant. The one on the right is very punchy, but it becomes, again, like I was saying, that graphic kind of flattened image, which is fun. And these become more about that like time of day and space. When we're talking about portraits, you want to be thinking about how you're composing that shot. And so what makes the most sense for your subject. And so I think a lot of people have this tendency to just hold their phone the way that you would when you're about to like put it up to your ear. And so that's not always the best way to present your view of the world. And so people also tend to think, okay, portraits for portraits and landscapes for landscapes. But in this example, I was thinking about my friend I was visiting. She's a painter. I wanted this kind of sense of space in her studio where she's working. So I flipped the phone landscape so I can get more of where she's actually working and start to kind of reveal a sense of where she was in that moment. As opposed to this portrait that I took of my husband, it's more just about him and is very clearly, I'm done with my wife taking pictures of me expression. And you kind of get this sense of leading lines out to the back, but it's more about him and less about the space. Same thing, another kind of landscape portrait that I'm getting this little bit of him in there, but it's more about the place that we were. It was at this historic home. Again, this was taken on my iPhone. And so I backed up instead of, I think it depends on the kind of photographer you are. Their natural inclination would be to walk up, sit down next to him and be like, can I take your portrait? And get that lovely kind of traditional chest up bust of a portrait that we think of. But because I was looking at this home and where he was and that lovely like contrast of the yellow house and his blue suit, I wanted more. And that's when I physically moved my body back to take that picture. So again, it's like Do you step up to your subject to take the picture, or do you back up to get a grander view of the space? Those are the creative decisions that you need to be thinking about as you lift your phone, as opposed to just like, I'm taking the picture right where I'm standing, exactly how I see it. These are some landscape examples. So I was talking about rule of thirds. You can see that I've kind of split up the foreground, background, and then the sky off into the distance into thirds. And so the one on the left, obviously, we're saying the sky is more of a third. The one on the right, the water line is more of the third. And then here, similar kind of thirds, but also we're getting that sense of space because I have something in the foreground and then this line that's kind of snaking throughout the scene to the back out into infinity. This is, when I'm shooting food, I love to shoot overhead so that it's very kind of trendy. A way to shoot food right now is looking above. But I also think that you just get a really clear sense of like it becoming about the food, but also these little shapes, just everything kind of broken up. It becomes a little more graphic in that way. And I always love to get someone's hand in there or some kind of action so it doesn't feel like, oh, just another picture of food, that it was more about that moment of us together, where we were, what was going on. And that way it feels more documentary than about the subject being just like all these pieces of pie that we ate. So here is a very blurry picture because it's actually a screenshot of my like tiny photos on my camera roll. I'm going to get into basic shooting information now. And one of the first things I'll say is that I love to bracket. So anyone who took like a basic photo class, I'm going to stop sharing now so that I can talk a little bit more about how to, do your basic shooting with your phone. Anyone who's taken a basic photo class will know that usually you're encouraged to do something called bracketing. And so that's taking an image that's both underexposed and overexposed, and then whatever the camera suggests the exposure should be. And so what I had just shown you was an example of how I kind of do bracketing with an iPhone. And for anyone who is just starting out, I really highly recommend shooting this way because it's kind of foolproof that if you go back to your images and you're like, wow, that's really overexposed, and you only took that one image, it's very hard because the quality of your iPhone is just not there. It's not like when you shoot with a DSLR, you can really bring back that blown out exposure. It's just not going to happen with an iPhone. So again, knowing the limitations of the tool you're using. So I shoot something, generally, I won't really even do overexposed. I will just do a bracketing of what the iPhone is kind of recommending, and then something that's a little darker. And so that's what that scene was. It was okay. It was getting towards sunset, a little too dark for my iPhone to really handle. So I shot something that was what it recommended, which is normally a little lighter than what you probably want. Because remember, the iPhone is just taking an average of the whole scene that you're presenting in front of it and then saying, this is probably good enough for this bright highlight and the shadow. And you'll be able to see everything, hopefully. But usually that's not the case. And so make the distinct decision, like, is that highlight more important to you? Is the shadow more important to you? Your subject needs to be visible. And then I normally dial it back a little bit. Always make sure your lens is clean. I'm really bad about this. It's been in your pocket all day. This is like a very silly bit of information, but I always forget. And then I'm like, why does my picture look all blurry? It's because my lens is dirty from just being in my pocket or being face down on a table and it's got some kind of schmutz on it. Like I said, I always shoot in the basic camera mode, and I do always select my subject. There's a little box, and so I'll select my subject. I actually have lemons set up here so I can take some pictures for you guys. There's going to be a little box that appears, and that's going to be where your camera's pulling focus. And so it's doing this all kind of digitally within your camera. And I'm going to pull focus, and there's a little yellow sun that appears. And all you want to do is put your finger on that sun and drag it down, and you'll see that it starts to decrease what your exposure is. Or if you drag it up, it'll blow it out, it'll make it much brighter. And so what I'll normally do is I choose my subject, I take a picture, what it recommends, I choose my subject and if you want them to be exactly the same, you can hold down that focal point and it will lock your focus because there is actually a little bit of depth of field happening in the iPhone camera. So that's when you get the subject matter being tack sharp and focused and everything beyond that falling off and getting a little blurry. So I'll take my picture and then I'll actually do something that's a little darker. And then normally I'll take something that's even darker than that. Sometimes I surprise myself and I really love the super dark one. And you don't really have any other way of knowing if your exposure is what you want it to be other than your eyes on an iPhone. You're going to look at it, you're going to decide if it looks good, which is kind of hard because you don't have like on a camera, it's going to tell you like this is exposed correctly. You got to look at it and decide, which I hope for you guys is a relief because you're just using your best judgment, your sense of taste to decide if you think this looks good. And so then when I look through the images, I have this bracketed little grouping of super dark, a little darker, and then what the phone actually recommended. And I know it's hard because it's through my webcam, but you can see that this looks a little too hot, a little too bright. And then this looks better. I actually see more detail in that windowsill. And then here I'm getting the most detail, but maybe my shadows are a little too dark. But this is going to be a little easier to edit on the iPhone than something that's brighter, because again, we're not really going to get that information back from those highlights in the way we would on an actual camera. If your subject is moving quite quickly, you can shoot in burst mode. I think that's always a good idea. Or if you are like a little shaky, it's good, or uncertain, it'll just give you a couple extra images. Basic photography shooting rules apply again. And so you want to kind of take a deep breath when you're shooting, set up your scene. If you're happy with how it looks, especially if it's later in the day and you might get like a little camera shake because your camera is going to pick up any movement from you. You take a deep breath and you brace yourself and you take the picture, exhale. If it's possible, if you are particularly shaky like I am, you can brace yourself against a wall, like if you're outside, against a piece of furniture. Again, this might sound a little silly to you, but it helps you get a clearer, crisper picture if you're really holding still. I just actually bought a little tripod adapter so that I can put my phone on my tripod. If that's something that you're into, go for it. Again, you can buy them online really easily and attach them to almost any tripod. It also makes it easier for shooting with your rear camera for things like selfies. So I really don't love using the front camera. It's not only lesser quality than the rear camera most of the time. Again, I'm kind of speaking predominantly for iPhone and less for other cameras that I don't know quite as well. Less quality on the front. And it also, you can turn it off, but it often mirrors your image. And so it's going to look kind of bizarre to you. And also, we're just not, again, it's the same thing. We're always getting like the same angles. There's not much further we can get than just however far away our hand is. And so if we set our self timer on, which you can set for 2 or 10 seconds on the iPhone, put it on a tripod, or mine, I love to tell people just get creative. Like I said, I have a little like fake photo studio in my room, and it's literally just like a window that's in my room and a piece of foam core to put stuff on to take better pictures, and that's it. Sometimes I bring this LED light in if it's too dark. My whole life, since I first started taking pictures, I will just like prop this up against something to take a picture on the self timer. That's always going to be a little bit better than just like holding your phone out like this and doing your best to like get that angle. And along with that, I'll say don't zoom. Like I started off saying, move your feet, move your body. Don't just like stand where you are and try to take the best picture. You have to get like physical with it. And so when you zoom, it's just going to degrade that image even further. It's just gonna, everything that's happening is kind of artificial. So I don't love to use a flash. I don't love to use the front camera, and I don't love to use portrait mode, which may be highly controversial to everybody here today. But it does give the appearance of a DSLR or something that has really strong depth of field, but appearance is the key word. So the iPhone is doing its best to approximate things and to replicate things. And so I would always rather make sure that my scene is clear, that there's nothing too busy behind my image, and take a really nice crisp picture rather than something that when I use that option, it's going to make maybe like my ear blurry too, or a harsh line around my face. Um, to me, those images don't read as like, oh, that was taken with a very nice camera with a good lens on it. It reads as like the background is kind of schmeary, like it looks a little muddy and messy, and I can still tell that there's garbage behind you. It's just blurred garbage. So don't use portrait mode. Occasionally it's okay, but just try to set a better scene, and then the picture's going to be better too. And it's going to look more professional, in my opinion, than just slapping portrait mode on. So when I'm shooting, I'm going to take a couple different angles. I'm going to change the way that I'm shooting based on my subject matter. Everyone is either a portrait person or a landscape person. So it's what's up for you too, like what you think is best. So either like you're going to be someone who's always going like this or someone who always goes like this, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just how we're wired. So I'm going to take my picture, set my focal point, bring down my exposure a little. And what I'm talking about when I'm saying setting the scene is like, okay, so this, I'm not really getting anything. I'm just getting like a little bit of that windowsill, which is okay. I think what I see more often than not, people will say, I need to take this picture of lemons. And then I'm just getting like my printer and some like greeting cards in the background. And yes, I got the picture of the lemons, but it's not a very good picture. Whereas even this is just like slightly better. So what I'm going to talk about now is post-processing, so editing that image once you've taken it. So there's a million different apps that you can get. I just use ViscoCam. I'm sure many of you have it on your phone. It's my ideal one. I have the Adobe Suite. I've downloaded the Lightroom app for iPhone. I always go back to Visco, and I know that you can use it to also share your photos. I don't do that. I just use it to edit my photos, and I'm such a creature of habit. I have never switched. Like I said, I don't even shoot in Visco, even though you can make adjustments. I shoot in the camera app. I bring it into Visco. I do some very light editing, and I call it a day. I always want to have the most basic file I can. That's one of the reasons why I do the bracketing, most basic file I can, and then I'm going to kind of like adjust it from there to make it exactly how I want. I never shoot with any kind of filter on automatically. I never try to shoot with any other pre-programmed anything. I just want the most basic file, so that way I can go back to it, adjust it how I want, and I'm not stuck with that decision already made for me. And that's how I work in my regular photographic practice as well, so it's not really that different. I always want to be able to walk things back, which maybe that's like a little bit control freakish of me, but I want to be able to like go back to it and be like, I want to change this. Whereas if I slap a black and white filter on it from the get-go, I'm never going to be able to walk that back. So when you're editing, you're always editing based on sight. So it's important to remember just what looks good to you. But you also need to be thinking about how other people are going to see the image. That's one of the hardest parts, is that our phones aren't calibrated to how everyone else is going to see it or how it's going to get printed. So what I like to do is set my phone to about 75, 80% brightness. I make sure that night vision is on iPhone. I actually usually turn off the true tone option as well. I just want it to be as basic as possible. I don't want it to be influenced by any other light in the room. I don't like to have like the auto brightness on, but 75% is kind of a good average. I'm one of those people that has my phone on like 10% brightness all the time. My husband has his on 100%, even in the dead of night. So you're never going to be able to really know who out in the world is looking at your Instagram. So I think 75% is like a good average to work with. And then I do, even though I was just like talking down about filters, I normally put a little preset filter on the phone, on my picture first. So I do that when I'm editing on my phone. I just want it to be really fast and simple and easy, and I can get an effect that I really like. That being said, I never leave the filter at like 100%. I'll normally drop it down to say like a 50% opacity or even lower. So I just get a little bit of that adjustment. It'll normally brighten it up a little, increase the saturation, things like that really quickly. I don't have to go through every option. And I'll normally be in a pretty good place to already export it and upload it to Instagram. It just makes that workflow a little faster, and it's a little less thinking for you, because at the end of the day, it should still be fun, even for those of you who might be doing this for work. And then the other thing I'll say is to always export the app, your photo at full size. So that way, if you decide that you want a printer or if it's going to get shared elsewhere, it's the highest possible resolution, rather than it will give you the option to make like a smaller image. For the most part, what you're shooting on your phone is just a JPEG file, which is a compressed file. It's smaller, it's easy to disseminate, which is great. It's great to share online, but it's not the highest quality. And say for like printing, my recommendation would be, if you want to make really large, pretty prints, is to actually maybe go a little harsher with a filter, because that starts to hide some of the imperfections. Like I was talking about before, black and white. If you want my advice for black and white photography, is just go back to light. So the best images in black and white are not the ones that you're like, okay, it's a little busy. I don't really love the colors in this. That's not when we use black and white. We use black and white when the light is really gorgeous, it's really intense, and we're getting a lot of shadow and highlight and a great range within that image. It's not something that we just like slap on to say like, this is not the best picture, but black and white will fix it. And so black and white, sometimes then it can help like soften the not best image. But I still wouldn't just like jump to that. I wouldn't jump to like a heavily processed Instagram filter either. You want to kind of like find that happy medium between the image that looks like how you took it out in the world and something that looks a little bit better than how you took it out in the world. So I am going to show you guys really quickly. It's not the best quality because this is just my iMac camera, but I have my little like cameras mirror set up so I can show you guys. So I have to decrease my brightness just so you can see a little bit better. It's a little bright. So these are all my pictures in Visco. I took this one of lemons, or actually I'll add one. This is the one that I just took while we were talking. It adds it into my grouping, and I'm going to edit. There's this button here. It's like 2 lines of dots on it. And then that brings you into all the filters automatically. It looks like a little Polaroid picture. And then you can just choose them, adjust them. And what you want to do is when you choose one, you can tap on it. And that's going to allow you to increase or decrease how much the filter is affecting the image. So again, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, but it's just really intensely filtered. That's up at, it's a 12 scale, or I'll bring it down to say that's like 3. And I'll hit check to say okay. And then you want to go over to the 2 bars with the dots on it. And this is going to give you kind of, if anyone has worked, say, in Photoshop or whatnot, those kind of controls. So I can adjust the exposure, I can bring it up and down. And again, remember, there's no real right or wrong to this, because you're doing it based on what you see, like how this image looks to you. So you can bring up the exposure a little bit. What I really want to talk about, where I see people sometimes making mistakes, is sharpening an image. So yes, I can really go crazy with the sharpening, and that'll give you kind of those like grainy, crazy edges. I think that that looks very fake. And so again, if that's a look you're going for, don't let me knock you down about it. But I don't think it's the most professional look for anyone out there who's like, okay, I'm taking pictures for my company now, for something at work, promotional materials, not just lemons in my office. I say over sharpening does not solve a blurry photo. It doesn't solve a photo where you've like shaken the camera as you're taking it, and it hasn't solved it if it's out of focus. Sharpening will just make it like pop a little bit more. So if you haven't taken a photo with good light, or you haven't taken a photo that's in focus, there's really nothing you can do to like totally fix that. So I say take the better picture from the start. Saturation is just going to boost up those colors if you want. That's something that I think is a telltale sign of people not really feeling comfortable with how they're editing photos. They'll just like boost that the saturation up as high as they can. Again, it's like an interesting look, but not necessarily the most like professional looking, if that's what we're talking about. And then tone and balance are two things that I think most people probably don't think about when they're editing, but maybe should be paying closer attention to. Tone is where so I'll show you actually that image I had taken before of the windowsill that was like a little too bright. Tone is where we're going to bring it down. So I'll actually make it even a little brighter. So what we're looking at when we look at tone is highlights and shadows. So highlights is that intensely white area, and then the shadow is a shadow. So what you'll do is by adjusting the tone, it will actually bring those highlights down. So you can kind of see if you're looking at the top of my screen, that is how it was taken, and then it brings it down. On an iPhone, you do have to be a little careful because it'll make it look a little gritty. It'll give this artifacting, which is the image kind of losing its original texture. So I wouldn't go, again, everything in moderation. I'm not going to blow that out to 12, but if they're a little hot, I can bring that back to a certain extent in the app. Same thing if your image is really shadowy, like in my slides, I showed that picture of the, I think they were geraniums, super shadowy. If I wanted a little detail, I can bring those shadows back in. And then for white balance, if you're shooting something like with a tungsten light bulb, like I was talking about, or just not the most desirable light, again, best thing to do is get the best light and exposure in the camera, but we can adjust it. If it was too yellow, we can bring it down a little bluer to look more like daylight. If it's too green or magenta, we can slide those in the other directions as well to get it to the point where it looks the most natural and the most like how you want it to look. Some other tips I will say is that things that are kind of like a giveaway. Oh, you can see my office is messy over there. Things that are kind of giveaways that an image is like a little too intense when you're editing is that grass, you don't want it to be like green, blown out of proportion green. So the best thing you can do is drop down that saturation a little bit. There's also in VSCO a hue, saturation, and levels option. So that's the very last thing. It looks like a little color wheel. And what I'll do is I'll actually adjust the green so it looks like this. I will adjust the green not just in saturation, but in hue to be a little more yellow. And that way it doesn't look like you took your picture on a golf course. And the other thing is skin. So a lot of you want to take pictures of yourself, of your loved ones. And what I'll do is I'll drop down the saturation. Everyone's skin tends to get like a little red. I'll drop it down a little bit, and I'll also make it maybe a little more yellow, but you also don't want to go too far because that will make you look like a ghost or someone who's never walked outside before. So those are kind of like my go-to editing options. I'm just going to show a couple more slides. And then if anyone has any other questions. So this was what I was talking about, bracketing. So you can see how that image was actually taken on the far left. I took something much darker and then realized that the one on the right is probably like a happy medium, and it's because there was very limited light. It was towards the end of the day, towards sunset. So these were some sample pictures I took last night. This is just the soda water. I dressed it up just for you guys. And so this is how I think most people would maybe just like pull their phone out, be like, okay, I want to take a picture of this. Even for work, like I was talking about, some of the girls were taking pictures like this. And it's like, okay, so because the iPhone camera is actually very good, there is a decent amount of depth of field. So you're seeing that background. This wasn't shot on portrait. It is blurred. It's slightly out of focus because I pulled focus to the glass. This is technically backlit. And so that's what you want to be thinking about when you're lighting a scenario is you want the light to be coming in from the side or directly in front of your subject, not usually. So if I was taking a portrait of myself with the window behind me, but in this case, it's actually working okay because it's a glass and so it's permeating through. But important to think about for portraits, you don't want the window or whatever light source it is to be directly behind them. And there's just a lot going on behind it. So this is one of the pictures I would be like, it's not the best, we can do better. So I moved across the room and I took the picture on the left. So that's just on the table. That was like kind of a mess. There's a window to the right of it. I pulled the shade behind it. Just get creative with what you already have. I'm not telling you all to go out and buy an LED light bank. use the window, go outside. Like I love to take, if I've made something really nice to eat, I take it outside to take the picture, which to some of you might seem extra, but I think a lot of you are on this today to try to take better pictures. That's how I do it. And then the one on the right, like I said, when it comes to food, I love to get someone's hand in there. I love there to be like a little action. The one on the right is probably what I would post on my personal Instagram. It's like a little flat looking and a little more illustrative, whereas the one on the left is more traditional. This is my dinner last night. Brighter light, but you like funny glare. It makes everything look like a little too shiny and weird. The one on the right was technically less light, but I think more natural looking, and I was still getting some light cast over from a lamp. And so just thinking about, even something as simple, what's behind my subject matter, that's just a table, but still it's not getting that like harsh bounce back. I'm getting a little more natural shadow. The plates are going off the page. So it's giving that sense of something continuing beyond the frame that I've created. And then these are the pictures I was talking about. So the one on the left was just the lamp. It's a little blurry. You can see that there's some motion blur from him moving his head. To me, that feels more natural to the moment. So I'm kind of fine with letting that be what it is. I like the highlight on his sock. It feels, again, more natural to me. Whereas the right, I brought my little LED light bank in and I shone some light on him. And so, maybe it's a little clearer, a little easier to see in those shadows, but it's not the same feeling. So those were my examples from yesterday, just to show like very simple. This was end of day, not great light. So you can see they're like a little grainy too, but it is what it is. Don't push the camera phone beyond what it's supposed to be. Have fun with it. And I think just number one thing, how I start off with, think about your iPhone as your camera. Don't think about it as your phone. Thank you so much again, guys, for having me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer.
We have a couple questions that came in through the chat.
Yeah.
The first one being, in your opinion, what's the top thing to think about when you're trying to take an in-the-moment photo? So when you want to capture a photo, but you don't have the time to really set it up.
Okay. So in the moment, like you're photographing like an event or something that's happening. For me, it's like trying to find the best spot to position myself. So not like setting them up, but like, okay, when I'm photographing, say, family photos, I'm not always just going to like plot myself in one spot. I'm going to shoot pretty rapidly. So that's when that like burst mode comes into play, or just like feeling more comfortable, which again is like shooting more will get you to be more comfortable using your camera. And then taking like a couple different styles. So do I want something landscape or portrait? Kind of like going through that workflow right away. Like this scene looks better in landscape than it does portrait. So the rest of the pictures I might take landscape. I think that the scene that I'm seeing from over here is better than from over there. So I'm going to plot myself here to take the picture. And then occasionally being comfortable asking what the person that you're photographing, if that's what it is, because that tends to be the hardest for people to get used to kind of adjusting to, is asking them to do things. I think people feel really uncomfortable asking for something in their photos. And the more comfortable you can get to be like, hey, can you actually just like shift yourself this way a little bit, the better photo you're going to take. If you're doing like full documentary out in the world, it's a matter of just getting really comfortable with your camera, which might sound like not the answer you want, but I don't think there is like a secret trick to it. It's just knowing what looks better and then putting yourself in that position to take the picture. And so then you can kind of like make those decisions in a split second, and then you're going to get the best possible outcome as it's happening.
The next question was, can you give some advice on taking a photo with a mixed race couple? So when you have darker skin and fairer skin, they said they can never get a good picture. Do you have some advice for that?
I think so. That's one of the hardest things to do, is to adjust for skin tone, especially in that case, because you're either going to have someone who looks especially underexposed or someone who looks overexposed. I think so if I'm using my phone, again, it's going to be a little harder because you want to expose for whoever I would say has the darker skin tone, because it's going to be harder to bring back the or I guess maybe the opposite is what I would say. I'm sorry. I would expose for the lighter skin tone on the phone because it's harder to bring back that overexposed skin tone, and you can kind of bring up the shadows. And I would also just make sure again that you're in a really good light source. So that's going to be the hardest part, is adjusting it after the fact, because you probably will have to do a little bit of adjusting. You want to find like a middle ground that looks good for both of them. And I think that would be photographing for the lighter skin tone and then making sure that that looks good and bringing up the shadows of the darker skin tone on your phone. If it was a regular like DSLR or another camera, I would try to maybe split the difference. It depends on the quality of your camera, how much you can bring back that highlight. But yeah, I would go for the lighter skin tone and then bring up the shadows of the darker skin tone. But above all, make sure that you have a good amount of light, because that will give you the best possible quality file to work with to bring back that information. If you have a low light scenario, when you start to bring up the person who has the darker skin tone, they're going to look like a little grainy and not as good quality as the person with the lighter skin tone. So that's my go-to, is like make sure you have really good light in that scenario so that you can really work with that file.
Best tips for family shots with children. Lots of them.
Lots of children or lots of tips?
Lots of children.
Lots of children. Oh gosh. My brother has 4 children. I always just think about like I don't take their family pictures, and I'm kind of glad I don't, because it's intense. I just photographed a very rambunctious 2-year-old, and it was quite difficult. We got some great photos out of it, but he had no interest in being photographed. It was actually like I couldn't have made it up, but he knows baby sign language, and he kept saying all these different things, and then he just wasn't really feeling it, and finally at the end he went like this, and I said, what does that mean again? And the mom said, all done. He did not want to take a picture, and so what we finally ended up doing is finding the couple things he was interested in to hold his attention. He loved the sign. We were at like a walking trail, and so you can't really see it in the frame, but the sign is to the side of them because it kept him intrigued long enough that we could take the picture. I think that going somewhere that feels really comfortable for you and for them to shoot, whether that's like at home in their backyard or somewhere that they know pretty well, going somewhere where there's a little space to move out is helpful. And then I kind of always take the like more is best approach when it comes to families, especially if there's a lot of kids, that I'm just like shooting, because I might get like 1 out of every 10, or like all the kids are looking, everybody is smiling. Also accepting like you might not get many pictures of like everyone is happy, everyone is looking at the camera. There's going to be a couple that like just don't look the best. And then I always like to take like the documentary approach, is that you take an image of the scene overall, and then you take some like close-up detail shots. And I try to think about that with portraits as well. I take the whole family together, I take maybe like the couple together, and then the kids together, and then individual ones of the kids. And then surely throughout all of that, there's going to be something that's good. And I also love to take pictures that feel very natural. So like the kids playing, because they're gonna be happier than if you're like, okay, sit here like we're at a JCPenney in 1995 and look at me and take the picture, and that's it. I think when you can get more into their element, a little better off you'll be.
All right, so we are at about 1 o'clock. We'll ask a few more questions. If you guys have to drop off, that's totally okay. If your question was not able to get answered, feel free to reply to any of those emails that you received from Emily, and we can make sure those questions get to Kaleigh so that she can answer them for you. One last question here. Are there any rules regarding how much of a person's body should be in a photo, full body, chest up? What's your opinion on that?
So there are some rules, but the main rule is it's up to you what the image is going to be like. You don't want to cut anyone off. So you don't want to decapitate them. You don't want to end up like even if there's someone that's not like the main focus of the frame, you don't want their head to be chopped off. You don't want to chop off their feet and you don't want to chop off their hands. So you want it to look the most natural as possible. So what that normally means is like chest up is good for like a headshot. For a full body, you want to make sure you have those feet in there and that you're not cutting their feet off to like right at the bottom of the frame. You want there to be some like breathing room around their body. And you want to try to like not cut off any other limbs as well. If you do have to, so say you're only going to do like a 3/4 view, you want to kind of cut at the middle of the calf. You don't want it to be too close to the ankles or too close to the knees. You want to avoid like the joints. Because that's going to make the most normal looking photo, as opposed to like if you cut off right at the knees, it looks a little bizarre. Like there's just something about it, it looks non-natural. So I would say just to avoid the joints, and if you can, try to get their full body or at the calf or at the chest. And those are kind of like the typical portrait styles.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much, Kaleigh, and thank you everyone for tuning in. As you can see, this is being recorded, so we'll be sending out the recording. And as Lauren mentioned, should you have if your question was not answered, just shoot me an email. We can certainly get that answered for you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.